Good morning and happy Monday. I apologize that I'm getting this lecture to you a little bit later today than I maybe would have intended. Regardless, here we are. We are transitioning our conversation from learning to memory. Today we're going to talk about kind of the first steps of the memory process in encoding and storage. Tomorrow we are going to talk about retrieval and forgetting. Do note I sent this out in a Canvas announcement, but the chapters 7 and 8 FRQ I am going to have open for you on both Wednesday and Thursday. I understand some of you are taking finals or you have final projects to get done, so I want to make sure that I'm being flexible and allowing you to kind of use your time in a way that's best for you. And so the FRQ will be available on Wednesday and Thursday. It'll be available as normal from 8:20 to 3:10. If you need anything from me or have any adjustments that you need to make, just let me know, and we can do that. So, memory, enjoy. There's a couple of videos in here, a couple of activities, a couple of quick memory tests. So hopefully it's kind of fun. And then tomorrow's our last day of lectures.
All right, you guys, so like I said, we are going to shift our attention away from some of those learning concepts, right? Thinking back to last week when we had classical and operant conditioning as well as observational learning, and now we're going to shift and look at memory and how do we retain the information that we do in fact learn, and how do we transition that into memory. On Friday, you guys watched that documentary that looked at memory and what we know about it, which isn't a ton. So today we're just going to kind of break down what we do know about memory, how we classify different types of memory. Tomorrow we will be looking at forgetting and how do we lose memories, right? All of that, and it's going to hopefully tie together with our learning chapter, and then you have your FRQ on Wednesday or Thursday, whichever works best for you. So here we go. A memory refers to the persistence of learning over time through the storage and retrieval of information and skills, right? Once we learn something, right, where does it get stored in our brain so that when we need it, we can kind of unfile it and use it when we need it. So there are three behaviors that show that memory is in fact functioning. You have recall, recognition, and relearning. Basically, right, recall is it's an analogy to fill in the blank. You retrieve information previously learned and unconsciously stored, right? So like you remember the actual information itself, and you can recall that information and fill it out in like a fill in the blank type of written test, right? Recognition is going to be form of multiple choice, right? You can identify a stimuli to match, but you maybe can't recall it as it is on its own from your general memory. And then the last one here is relearning, and it's a measure of how much less work it takes for you to learn information you had studied before, right? So like if you are somebody who is taking AP Psychology next year, right, you're going to be learning the second half of the textbook, and the question is, how much relearning are you going to have to do when you go back and talk about units 1 and 2 and 3, right? Biopsych, research strategies. When you look at those things, how much time do you have to spend on them? Probably less than you did the first time around, right? And then all of a sudden, the AP exam comes around, and maybe you're going to look at all that information again, and to remember it, you're going to have to study less amount of time. So that's our kind of concepts behind when memory is in fact doing what it's supposed to be doing. So we're going to start here and just look at this simplified description of how memory works. You have three kind of steps in the process. You have encoding, you have storage, and you have retrieval. Now all of them are kind of like step-by-step processes. The first thing that you do is you encode information. That's how the information gets into our brains in a way that allows it to then be stored. Storage is that the information is held in a way that allows it to later be retrieved, and retrieval is reactivating and recalling the information, producing it in a form similar to what we encoded. This should be pretty intuitive to you. You all know how like you remember things. We're going to look at each of these in a more specific way. And we're going to start by looking at this kind of graphic organizer that's going to show us each of the pieces of the puzzle. So I suggest potentially putting this kind of chart in your notes, just because it's a visual way to remember like what do you need to know and how are you going to like decipher between all of these definitions. So like I said, we're going to talk about encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding and storage will be today, and then tomorrow will be retrieval and memory loss or failure to remember things. So just recognize that when we talk about those ideas, failure can happen in any of these categories, right? So when you're studying for a test, you may fail to properly encode the information. You might not get the proper information into your brain. You may have a difficult time even if you have encoded the proper stuff, storing it in your brain. And then the last piece of the puzzle is on a test, you may forget or you may not be able to retrieve that information. So note, kind of a step-by-step process. We're going to look at encoding and storage today, and like I said, retrieval tomorrow. So with that, we are going to do a couple of little examples. Obviously, they're not going to be as impactful as they would have been if we were in class together, but we're going to do our best. So real quick, name each of the 7 dwarfs from the movie Snow White. Ready, go. Do, 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 do. Do your best. Think about them. Do you have them? If you need to pause, feel free. But if you're like, I know all these, I have to think of them. If you're one of those people, feel free to pause. Otherwise, we have Dopey, Bashful, Sneezy, Sleepy, Happy, Grumpy, and Doc, right? So when we're talking about memory, how did you remember this stuff, right? There is a researcher named her name is Miserandino, and she reports that based on her research, 12 out of 66 students were able to correctly name all the 7 dwarfs. But in order to kind of get to this conclusion, right, we must first get the information into our brains. Maybe you are somebody who never saw Snow White and therefore never encoded, right? You never took in information about these different dwarfs. You also had to retain it over time, right? You had to store that information. If you did in fact see the movie, right, and you had to store that information, who these 7 dwarfs were, over time. And now you were asked to get it back out, right? So when we're talking about the retrieval process, just remember back a couple of slides, recall, recognition, and relearning, right? Now that you see these, the relearning process is probably going to be a lot quicker, and in the future, you're going to be more quickly able to recall these 7 because you already knew them, you just had to quickly relearn them. So we are going to start by talking about how we encode information, right? And how do we actually get information into our brain. And so we're going to look at the difference between effortful and automatic processing. Effortful is basically what we know to be like studying, right? Oh no, this didn't load right. I'm going to take a picture. Okay, so effortful processing strategies are ways to encode information into memory to keep it from decaying and making it easier to retrieve. Like I said, this is studying. This is how we study. This is how we learn things effortfully, intentionally, on purpose. We have to know all of this information for a psych FRQ. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to study in whatever way that works best for me, right? Our short-term memory recall, we can really only remember 7 letters, but up to 5 words, right? In just kind of that automatic processing system, right? So we can remember 7 letters, 5 words, but if we don't intentionally or effortfully try to learn some of this stuff, it's going to be very difficult for us to store and then recall for, say, tests. So some examples of effortful processing are chunking, mnemonics, hierarchies, rehearsal, deep processing, semantic processing. We're going to look at those here in just a second. And then lastly, making information personally meaningful, right? Tying meaning to what you are learning, right? So think about it. Think about this list. Can you remember this list? Take a second, look at it. We're going to talk about a few of them in more detail. So yeah, here we go. Like I said, encoding has a bunch of different devices for us to better learn or store and then potentially retrieve information. So one of those ideas is chunking. If you've ever wondered why credit card numbers are broken into groups of 4 digits, these are 4 chunks and they're easier to encode or memorize than 16 individual digits. So what I'm going to have you do, I want you to take a second. I want you to memorize this list of letters, okay? So pause this video, do your best to memorize these particular letters, okay? Give yourself like 30 seconds to a minute. How'd that go? Probably not great. So what I'm going to suggest is this idea of chunking or organizing data into manageable units. Chunking works even better if we can assemble information into meaningful groups, right? So here we have X, IDK, KFC, FBI, BA, NAACP, CVS, SUV, ROFL, MBA, Q, right? Like if we're organizing these in ways like, oh yeah, I don't know, Kentucky Fried Chicken, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If we're applying meaning to what we're trying to remember, we're going to be more likely to be able to memorize it. So that's one kind of method for effortful processing to, again, store and potentially in the future retrieve information. I want you to read these words. Which words do you think are easier to remember? I want you to write down all of the words you recall from reading on that last slide. What do you remember from that last slide? All right. We encode better with the help of images. The things in our list, plain, cigar, do, shall, candy, vague, pizza, seam, fire, pencil, plain, cigar, pizza, pencil, those are things that you can visualize and therefore are things that you are more likely to remember. Cross-reference your list. Did you remember the words do and shall and seem and vague? Did you remember those words or did you remember more of the poignant visual words, right? So again, a bunch of things go into how we encode, how we take in information. And the next kind of piece of the puzzle here on from the previous list that I gave you is a mnemonic device. Basically, this is a memory trick that connects information to existing memory, such as imagery or structure, right? So all of you probably remember learning Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow, or homes for the different Great Lakes up north, PEMDAS. It's been a while since I've used PEMDAS, but please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, helps us remember which order we are doing our mathematical processes in, right? And then the last one here, you have January, February, March, April, May, June, July, you know. Maybe this isn't one that you guys used to do. I remember I did it with my mom all the time, but I think people thought I was kind of a crazy person. Anyway, mnemonic devices. Another way for us to kind of better encode information. We also have massed practice, and this is what like cramming for an exam would entail, right? And like research has been done, and I say this directly at all of you for your futures in academia. Cramming information all at once is not time effective. It doesn't work. Can you maybe swing it? Sometimes. but you aren't actually learning when you are engaging in this type of practice, and the reason is because of the spacing and the testing effects. Harry Barks did some research about people trying to memorize things really quickly in a short amount of time, and he basically, the study went like this. He said that the subjects could use half as many study sessions if they started studying 4 times as early, right? Starting your exam study early may seem like studying more, but it's actually a way to study less overall to get the same results. So you might study 1 hour every week for like 4 weeks before your final exam. And if you do that, right, when you go and you do your final studying the night or the 2 nights before your final exam, right, the amount of time you're going to have to put in is going to be less. So this is really looking at the spacing effect. And basically the spacing effect says that you will develop better retention and recall, especially in the long run, if you use the same amount of study time spread out over many shorter sessions, right? So instead of studying for 10 hours the night before a test, if you study 10 hours or like a half hour, 20 times throughout the upcoming weeks, you're going to better remember information, right? The testing effect says that if your distributed practice includes having, this is apparently I can't read today. The testing effect says that if your distributed practice includes testing, you will learn more and retain more than if you merely reread. So this idea is saying, like, take as many practice quizzes as you can, right? Make up practice test questions, make up practice FRQ questions if you're studying for a psych FRQ, right? Like, if you are practicing the behavior in which you are going to be asked to recall information, you are more likely to then remember that information, right? Recent research seems to show that the testing effects works even if you don't know most of the answers yet. It's as if the questions create a placeholder in your mind for the information, right? So I'm sure you've all done this before where you're like, oh yeah, I got that question wrong on the practice quiz. What was that again? And then you remember more concretely and more effectively the answer to that question or what the definition to that term might be because you're attaching some sort of meaning to it, right? So we have the spacing effect and the testing effect that all fall under this idea of massed practice. Both of them kind of undermine this idea that cramming is a successful way to study. It is not a successful way to study. And then the last piece of the puzzle here for encoding is looking at the different types of processing within encoding. You have visual, acoustic, and semantic processing. And really, when you're going to see some of these ideas on like an FRQ or on a future test, right, they're going to be talking about deep, shallow, or intermediate processing. Shallow processing is this idea of visual processing. We see something and we maybe remember it, but unless we hear it or put meaning to it, we're very unlikely to remember it. So shallow processing is unsuccessful because it's memorizing the appearance or sound of words, right? So you might see the letters like plane, P-L-A-N-E, right? Like we saw on the previous slide. You might see those letters, but when you're recalling that word, you aren't recalling like the individual letters, right? You're recalling your memory of the word and the visual that is associated with the letters P-L-A-N-E. Intermediate processing then is that acoustic processing, and that's like with the sound of the word, if it rhymes with, I know when I was in college, I made up a lot of like songs and like raps to remember information in my history major. And that was one way that I could like process and recall information. But the best type of processing is going to be semantic processing. And this is when we are associating meaning to what we are learning, right? When encoding information, we are more likely to retain it if we deeply process even as a simple word list by focusing on the semantics behind the word. So like it's easier for us to remember a sentence because when the words come together, they create meaning than it is for us to try and remember those words individually. Okay? So basically basically that's what we have when we're talking about encoding. Now there's obviously going to be pretty significant overlap between encoding and storage, just because like the process itself like is very unclear where like encoding starts and storage begins. Research has been unable to like really figure out like where in the brain, as you saw in the documentary on Friday, research has had a very difficult time figuring out where in the brain memories are like quote unquote located. And so it's difficult to kind of track this trajectory. So there is a lot of overlap, but I'm going to kind of try and frame it through that initial chart that we looked at. So like the encode, store, retrieve, and the things that go under it. So I'm trying to just kind of follow that process to keep things organized. So with that, and we're looking at storage now, right? And how do we keep information in our brain? We're going to shift our attention from effortful processing to automatic processing, right? There are things that we like experience in life that we're not like, ooh, I have to put that in my memory. I have to work really hard to remember that, right? Things like experiences, how to ride a bike, right? Feelings that you might have, right? Some of that stuff is processed automatically and you remember it, not because you tell yourself, I have to remember that, but because automatically your brain just does. And so we're shifting away from this effortful processing piece of encoding to like how we might encode information and store it in an automatic way. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model, you actually don't have to know this model, but the textbook refers to this model as our understanding of storage. So all of this fits into what is storage, how does our brain do storage, etc., etc. So with that, right, we know that there are kind of 3 different categories under which storage kind of occurs. You have sensory memories, you have short-term memory, and you have long-term memory. We are going to dig into each of these more specifically with the remainder of our lecture. We're going to watch a few videos, but I like to look at the bottom here, this like bottom image, because I think it's really telling and it helps us really recognize the process that is storage. So you have these external events, you have sensory input here, right? And those sensory inputs go into our sensory memory, which we'll look at a little bit more detail. But then if we pay attention to specific information, we might encode that information and it may get into our working or short-term memory. And if we continue to encode, right, we're going to see it stored in our long-term memory. Now you will also hear this idea of short-term memory referred to as working memory. So they're both the same thing, but short-term memory is more than just like rehearsals, right? You can have like short-term memory of not just like reading a short list or memorizing a phone number or whatever. It can be more experiential and whatnot. So they switched it from this like short-term memory to this term of working memory. So like I said, again, I'm just trying to keep us consistent with how we're going through this information. We did our encoding. Now we're going to be looking at storage. And so we'll look at sensory, short-term, and long-term memories, and how each of these kind of extra pieces fit into our understanding here. So sensory memories are essentially you're just taking in memories and storing these memories and these recollections based on what you are sensing, whether it's through your sight or through sound or touch, whatever it might be. So storage comes from sensory, or storage within the umbrella of storage. You have sensory memories, and those can be determined into echoic memories and iconic memories. These are pretty intuitive, right? Echoic memories are auditory sensory memories, and iconic memories are visual sensory memories. So what we see and what we hear. And when we're talking about what exactly is a sensory memory, I kind of referenced this already, but it basically refers to the immediate, very brief recording of sensory information before it is processed into short-term, working, or long-term memory. So like, if you look again at this bottom, we get this sensory input, right? And that goes directly into our sensory memory. We remember the sounds, we remember the sights, but until we encode it, right, we actually like take that information in, then that's when it goes into storage. It's a very brief capture of a sensory memory. It's not like we're going to remember it for very long unless we choose to encode that information, if our brain chooses to encode that information, whether it be automatic or effortful processing. And really, when we're talking about how brief these sensory memories are, they consist of about 3 to 4 second echo or a 1/20th of a second image, right? So like I'm looking outside my window, I'm seeing all my new sod and some trees, right? That image lasts in my memory for about 1/20th of a second, but since I'm continuously looking everywhere, right, that doesn't really matter. That's why I can afford to only remember what I'm seeing for 1/20th of a second, right? We also know that there's evidence of auditory sensory memory called an echoic memory, which I already referenced. That's what did I just say? Even if you weren't paying attention, you can retrieve about the last 8 words from echoic memory, just from what your brain is automatically processing when you're listening. And then to dig a little bit deeper into these iconic memories, we know that George Sperling, a psychologist and biologist, exposed people to 1/20th of a second view of a grid of letters, followed by a tone, which told them which row of letters to pull the iconic memory and recall. Right? Without the tone, people recalled about 50% of the letters. With the tone, recall for any of the rows was typically 100%, right? When we are talking about this iconic memory, right, visual sensory memory, you can look kind of at this down here, and you see like kind of the box of letters, and if the word middle was flashed because it's the same color, you would be able to recognize PGS. And that would stick in your memory, even if it was only shown to you for 1/20th of a second, which is pretty crazy, right? We can't really reproduce this experiment like from afar, but the animation kind of here looking at this is intended to just give a feel of the challenge, even though you're obviously a longer stimulus you're looking at than 1/20th of a second. So again, look at those iconic and echoic memories that fall under sensory memories. And going back to that chart. So we're in storage, we've talked about sensory memories. Now we are going to shift and look at short-term memory, or as it's now called, working memory. So when we're talking about short-term memory or working memory, right, we know that this type of memory holds information not just to rehearse it, but to process it, right? Such as hearing a word problem in math and doing it in your head, right? Short-term memory integrates information from long-term memory with new information coming in from sensory. So this is kind of the next step between sensory, right, those ones that last for a very, very brief amount of time, and our brain says, okay, we're going to encode this, it's going to go into our short-term memory until we choose, or our automatic processing has us encode it further so that it'll stay in long-term memory. So working memory functions to repeat, like do things like auditory rehearsal, executive functions, videospatial sketch pads, right? Like these are the things that are going to help us encode things into our short-term memory, right? We might want to repeat a word, memorize it, choose what to attend or respond to, rearranging furniture in your mind, right? All of this is kind of telling us what the function of our short-term memory really is. So in regards to the capacity of our short-term memory, we know that our brains can store 7 digits or 6 letters or 5 words in order to actually keep that information for a reasonable amount of time and recall it later on, right? If some information is selected from sensory memory to be sent to short-term memory, how much information can we hold there? George Miller proposed that we can hold 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, right? A string of 5 to 9 letters. But more research suggests that people can hold, free from distraction, 7 digits, length of a phone number, 6 letters, or 5 words. The interesting piece here, again, notice that 5 words is probably more than 6 letters, but that's that semantic processing. That's when we're providing meaning to the word, right? We see plane, right, and we see pizza. We're going to remember those 2 words, and by and large, we are then, how many? Plane, Pizza, 5. We're remembering 10 letters, right, because we're associating meaning to those letters. Working memory, which uses rehearsal, focus, analysis, linking, and other processing, has greater capacity than short-term memory, right? The capacity of working memory varies from people who have better concentration or not as good concentration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip to the next slide. I'm going to ask you to remember the letters and the numbers on the next slide, okay? I want you to recall them once they disappear. Ready? Okay, I want you to write down how many that you can remember. How'd you do? Short-term memory, like I said, hold 7 digits, 6 letters, or 5 words. Because these letters and digits are not either chunked or written into a word or some sort of meaningful order, we're less likely to remember all of these things, right? Like we're less likely unless we're able to quickly see letters create words or numbers create something meaningful to us. We're less likely to be able to remember it for a longer period of time. So with that, in terms of how long people can use their short-term memory, we see that psychologists Lloyd Peterson and Margaret Peterson wanted to know the duration, and so they were given triplets of consonants, so like VMF. To prevent rehearsing, the subject had to do a distracting task. So I would say, okay, guys, remember VMF. Remember VMF. And then I would give you, say, like a puzzle. And I would make you work on that puzzle for X amount of time. And then they were tested, like, okay, do you remember the 3 letters that I gave you? After they've been doing the puzzle for like 5 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever. And that's how long people were able, if you're looking kind of at this chart over here, you see obviously a decrease in the amount of people who could recall those 3 consonants with time that was removed from the stimulus. Okay? So here we see after 12 seconds, most memory of the consonants had decayed and could not be retrieved. Now it's time to see if you remember the list from the effortful processing slide earlier in the presentation. So think back. There's a little teal slide or a teal box that I had to take a picture of and add to the slide. Do you remember any of the ideas at the bottom of that? It said, can you remember this list? Let us see. Did you remember the list? Chunking, mnemonics, hierarchies, rehearsal, deep processing, semantic processing, and making information personally meaningful. Maybe you remembered chunking and meaningful, right? There is research that has been done to show that there is reasonable, oh my gosh, I can't think. There is research that has proven that people are more likely to remember the first and the last thing of a group. We'll talk about that later on, actually tomorrow, when we talk about like recall and forgetting. But if you remembered some of this, good for you. It's been a hot second, and this is more allotted, this is more than the allotted 7 digits that your short memory should be able to hold. But that's why we engage in effortful processing. And this is why we have to go above and beyond that automatic processing in order to actually recall information that we have encoded. So we are going to watch a quick video on short-term memory and what that looks like, and then we're going to continue on talking about long-term memory and the different aspects of long-term memory.
Take a look at the number on your screen. Unless that number means something to you, your brain is already in the process of forgetting it. That's because short-term memory is a brief holding place for memories that have no long-term importance or emotional connection, but which might be useful in the immediate future. Like when you get the check at a restaurant. You only need to remember the total long enough to figure out the tip. A perfect job for your short-term memory, which lasts for no more than 30 seconds. So, how much was that bill we just showed you? Chances are you remember. But what about that 10-digit number we showed you earlier? Not only are those numbers outside your short-term memory's 30-second window, but there's also a cap on how much information can be stored there, usually around 4 or 5 items. Which is why your brain still remembers this, but not this. The good news is, you may be able to improve your short-term memory. All it takes is a dash of inspiration. To see what we mean, try to memorize this 10-digit number. Time's up. We'll give you a few seconds to let that sink in. Enjoy these elephants. Now, can you remember those numbers? Chances are you did, thanks to a technique called chunking, a simple tool we all use nearly every day.
Whether it's your social security number, credit card, or even your phone number, chunking longer number sequences into bite-sized pieces makes them much easier to remember. Simply adding a couple of dashes into a 10-digit number causes your brain to treat it as fewer items, putting less strain on your short-term memory.
So here's that chart again, right? We have talked about sensory memory, we've talked about long-term memory. So now we are going to break down, whoa, that was weird, it jumped, skipped. We are going to talk about long-term memory, explicit and implicit memories that fall within this particular category. So let's get started. Our brain does have a dual track processing system. So far, we've talked about effortful processing and automatic processing. Generally speaking, explicit memories, which are also referred to as declarative memories, are facts and experiences that we can consciously know and recall, right? Our minds acquire this information through effortful processing. And we know that explicit memories are formed through studying, rehearsing, thinking, processing, and then storing the information in long-term memory. That's like you have to know the difference between effortful processing and automatic processing. So you might sit down and you might study and you might make a Quizlet and you might study it effortful processing so that you can recall it when you take the chapters 7 and 8 FRQ, right? We also know that implicit memories are the ones we are not fully aware of and thus don't declare or talk about. These are generally formed through automatic processing, right? Implicit memories are formed without our awareness that we are building a memory. So just recognize kind of the difference. You have implicit and explicit memories that fall under long-term. Explicit, we're trying to remember. We're taking time, we're effortfully processing these and learning, right? Whereas implicit memories usually just kind of happen. They're the automatic processing that go into our working memory and then further into long-term memory. So when we talk about explicit memories, there are two kind of categories. You have semantic and you have episodic. Semantic, I've used that word a few times now. Semantic is defined by associating meaning, right? So semantic memory is a long-term memory involving the capacity to recall words, concepts, or numbers, which is essential for the use and understanding of language, right? We know that if we're able to kind of put together meaning behind the letters that we are seeing in the words and how they're associated with one another, we're more likely to remember that long term, and we need that understanding in order to produce language. When we talk about episodic memories, we know these are long-term memories that involve conscious recollection of previous experiences together with their context in terms of time, place, and associated emotions, right? So again, explicit memories are generally effortfully processed. We take time to learn them. So we have semantic memory, that's learning like words and grammar. Episodic memory is we are trying to remember, like, how did I behave this way so that I can do it again next time, or this worked, this didn't. I've practiced this puzzle, and now I'm going to do a harder puzzle, and I'm going to use the information or the skills that I've acquired to, in fact, do that. So you have semantic and episodic memories within explicit memories within long-term memory, okay? So then when we're talking about implicit memories, right, these are the ones that we basically kind of just learn through automatic processing but are still housed in our long-term memory. We don't really forget them very quickly. So within that, we have a procedural memory, such as knowledge of how to ride a bike, or any well-practiced knowledge, such as word meaning, right, vocabulary. I can say, like, this lecture is extremely riveting, and you might be like, oh, riveting, I know what that means. It's super exciting and engaging. Right, that's something that's ingrained in our brains, and we usually don't forget the meaning of words, right? If you play soccer, kicking a soccer ball is something that could be considered procedural memory, right? These things last in our brains, and they are stored within our long-term memory. We also know that within this we have conditioned associations, such as a smell that can trigger thoughts of a favorite place, right? Remember we talked about the olfactory bulb that went straight through our emotion processing centers in our brains. And so therefore we have stronger associations with smell and memory than we do with other senses in memory. Think of like grandma's snickerdoodle cookies or whatever, like, and it reminds you of Christmas time. We also know information about space, such as being able to picture where things are after walking through a room would fall under procedural memory. Information about time, such as retracing a sequence of events if you lost something. And then lastly, information about frequency, such as thinking, I just noticed this is the third driver I've passed today who has been texting, right? So all of these kind of fall under automatic processing. We also want to look though at like what the capacity for long-term memory is. We looked at the capacity for short-term memory, right? You looked at the graph that showed that after 12 seconds, people usually forgot the consonants. Here we are now though with like long-term memory. What is the capacity and how does it work, right? The brain is not like a hard drive. Oops, I forgot to change my slide. Memories are not in isolated files, but are in overlapping neural networks. So if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, it's probably not the most accurate portrayal of memory. It is a really good portrayal of emotion and the connection between memory and emotion. I digress. But they're not just like filed away like a computer, right? Carl Lashley showed that rats who had learned a maze retained parts of that memory even when various small parts of their brain were removed. Therefore, it's difficult for scientists and researchers to say, where does this information come from? Where is it stored in our brain, right? And so this was articulated in the documentary you watched on Friday, but I'm just kind of reiterating that again. When it comes to when it comes to this idea that if a memory is stored throughout the brain, how does it get in there and how do we retrieve it and use it, right? It's not a clear-cut answer, right? A couple of ideas that the textbook provide I have here on the slide. There are different storage and retrieval activation systems in the brain for both explicit memory and implicit memory. We also know that emotions become involved, yet another part of the brain can mark or flag some memories for quicker retrieval. And then the last piece here is that storage occurs by changing how neurons link to each other in order to make some well-used neural networks of neurons easier to activate together. Okay, so there's a couple of different working theories. We know that the brain works differently for different types of memories, but we don't exactly understand why or how that is. So with that, this is what we know. Explicit processing, retrieval and use of explicit memories is generally directed in the frontal lobe. We know that explicit memories include facts, stories, and meanings. And we know that the encoding and storage of explicit memories is facilitated by the hippocampus. Events and facts are held there for a couple of days before consolidating and then moving to other parts of the brain for long-term storage, right? Much of this consolidation happens during sleep. That's why sleep is so important. But when we're talking about explicit memory, so like studying for a test, right, learning new like content information or learning a new skill, how to ride a bike, how to juggle, right? Those types of things are going to function through the hippocampus and then go and get stored, again, wherever long-term memories are stored, which we don't really know, right? On the flip side, then you have implicit memories, skills, procedures, conditioned associations, things that like we're not necessarily intentionally trying to learn. Generally speaking, these go through our cerebellum and our basal ganglia. The cerebellum forms and stores our conditioned responses, right? We can store a phobic response even if we can't recall how we acquired the fear. We also know that the basal ganglia next to the thalamus controls movement and forms and stores procedural memories and motor skills. So these kind of make sense. These are a little bit more understandable, but then once the brain has encoded that and consolidated that information and like we remember like how to walk or how to do really, really common things that you're not, again, intentionally trying to learn, but you just automatically do so from experience or whatever. Saying hi to somebody as you pass them in the hallway because that's apparently what the social norm is, right? This gets stored in the cerebellum. So we are going to watch a short video, 5 minutes, and this talks about patient HM. I know that HM was referenced in the documentary on Friday that you watched, but I think this does a really good job, and I think also since we're talking about memory storage right now, it's going to make a lot more sense, and you can see kind of the relation between this particular study and our understanding of memory.
On September 1st, 1953, William Scoville used a hand crank and a cheap drill saw to bore into a young man's skull, cutting away vital pieces of his brain and sucking them out through a metal tube. But this wasn't a scene from a horror film or a gruesome police report. Dr. Scoville was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of his time, and the young man was Henry Molaison, the famous patient known as HM, whose case provided amazing insights into how our brains work. As a boy, Henry had cracked his skull in an accident and soon began having seizures, blacking out, and losing control of bodily functions. After enduring years of frequent episodes and even dropping out of high school, the desperate young man had turned to Dr. Scoville, a daredevil known for risky surgeries. Partial lobotomies had been used for decades to treat mental patients, based on the notion that mental functions were strictly localized to corresponding brain areas. Having successfully used them to reduce seizures in psychotics, Scoville decided to remove HM's hippocampus, a part of the limbic system that was associated with emotion, but whose function was unknown. At first glance, the operation had succeeded. HM's seizures virtually disappeared, with no change in personality, and his IQ even improved. But there was one problem. His memory was shot. Besides losing most of his memories from the previous decade, HM was unable to form new ones, forgetting what day it was, repeating comments, and even eating multiple meals in a row. When Scoville informed another expert, Wilder Penfield, of the results, he sent a PhD student named Brenda Milner to study HM at his parents' home, where he now spent his days doing odd chores and watching classic movies for the first time, over and over. What she discovered through a series of tests and interviews didn't just contribute greatly to the study of memory. It redefined what memory even meant. One of Milner's findings shed light on the obvious fact that although HM couldn't form new memories, he still retained information long enough from moment to moment to finish a sentence or find the bathroom. When Milner gave him a random number, He managed to remember it for 15 minutes by repeating it to himself constantly. But only 5 minutes later, he forgot the test had even taken place. Neuroscientists had thought of memory as monolithic, all of it essentially the same, and stored throughout the brain. Milner's results were not only the first clue for the now familiar distinction between short-term and long-term memory, but showed that each uses different brain regions. We now know that memory formation involves several steps. After immediate sensory data is temporarily transcribed by neurons in the cortex, it travels to the hippocampus, where special proteins work to strengthen the cortical synaptic connections. If the experience was strong enough, or we recall it periodically in the first few days, the hippocampus then transfers the memory back to the cortex for permanent storage. HM's mind could form the initial impressions, but without a hippocampus to perform this memory consolidation, they eroded like messages scrawled in sand. But this was not the only memory distinction Milner found. In a now famous experiment, she asked HM to trace a third star in the narrow space between the outlines of two concentric ones, while he could only see his paper and pencil through a mirror. Like anyone else performing such an awkward task for the first time, he did horribly. But surprisingly, he improved over repeated trials, even though he had no memory of previous attempts. His unconscious motor centers remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. What Milner had discovered was that the declarative memory of names, dates, and facts is different from the procedural memory of riding a bicycle or signing your name. And we now know that procedural memory relies more on the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that were intact in HM's brain. This distinction between knowing that and knowing how has underpinned all memory research since. HM died at the age of 82 after a mostly peaceful life in a nursing home. Over the years, he had been examined by more than 100 neuroscientists, making his the most studied mind in history. Upon his death, his brain was preserved and scanned before being cut into over 2,000 individual slices and photographed to form a digital map down to the level of individual neurons, all in a live broadcast watched by 400,000 people. Though HM spent most of his life forgetting things, he and his contributions to our understanding of memory will be remembered for generations to come.
Just a couple of more slides here, but one thing that helps us understand these implicit and explicit memories is our understanding of infantile amnesia. We've already talked about this when we talked about developmental psych, but basically for the first 3 years of our life, we don't really remember anything, right? This is called infantile amnesia. And why does this happen, right? We know that implicit memory from infancy can be retained, including skills and conditioned responses. When mom says no, you don't do something, or like if you cry, you get milk, so you continue to cry. But explicit memories, our recall of episodes, only goes back for like 3 years. So why is that? Well, our explanation can be found within encoding or within retrieval. So if encoding's the issue, the memories were not stored well because the hippocampus is one of the last brain areas to develop, right? That makes sense. If the area that is processing and storing our memories isn't functioning, then maybe we're not going to remember those long term, right? We could also say that the adult mind thinks more in a linear verbal narrative and has trouble accessing pre-verbal memories as declarative memories, right? Like I remember when my friends came over this weekend to help me lay sod, and I'm associating words, not just like visual movements of people doing something that I don't completely understand. Does that make sense? So there's a couple of ways that we can remember this, but I think infantile amnesia is a really good way to remember the difference between implicit and explicit. Implicit, babies remember how to like do things based on experience. Those are the automatic processing learning mechanisms, right? Whereas like explicit memories, they're not remembering the like very specific, intentionally learned stuff. Flashbulb memories then are emotionally intense events that become burned as a vivid seeming memory. Flashbulb memories are not as accurate as they feel, and I'm actually, instead of going into this, I'm going to let the SciShow talk you through it here real quick because they're very interesting and they're something that we all experience. But the question is, how accurate are they really?
Okay, pop quiz. What did you have for lunch yesterday? What about the day before? How about last Tuesday? You might remember yesterday, but you probably don't remember last week. And even if you have a guess, you might have some nagging doubts that it was something else. Now think of the most vivid memory you have. Maybe it was when one of your grandparents passed away, or when you graduated from high school, or your first breakup. You probably remember all sorts of details from what happened, like where you were, who you were with, and even the exact words someone said or the clothes you were wearing. Psychologists call these super detailed memories flashbulb memories. They get seared into your brain, and you're sure you remember everything about your experience, even years afterward, as if it were yesterday. But even your most vivid memories might not be as reliable as you think they are. I'm Britt Garner, and this is SciShow Psych. The term flashbulb memory was coined by psychologists Robert Brown and James Kulik in 1977 to describe the vivid memories people have after emotionally intense events. Many of the people Brown and Kulik talked to said the events that caused these memories were upsetting events in the news, like the assassinations of President Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. We don't know exactly how flashbulb memories form, but based on fMRI brain scans, scientists think two main parts of the brain are involved: the hippocampus, which helps form new memories, and the amygdala, which processes emotions. These memories can be difficult to study because the best way to do a good experiment is after an unexpected major news event, and researchers can't really plan for that in advance. Despite that, we've learned a fair amount over the years. We know, for example, that people create flashbulb memories around traumatic events, but they don't always have to be negative experiences. In 2007, researchers found that both East and West Germans formed flashbulb memories around the fall of the Berlin Wall, regardless of whether they thought it was a good or a bad thing. We also know that even though these memories are super vivid, they're not necessarily accurate. That's probably because people tend to think and talk about vivid memories a lot. Psychologists call this rehearsing a memory, and flashbulb memories can get rehearsed many, many times. But the rehearsal process isn't perfect. Your brain will often try to fill gaps in your memory with things that might feel like they're true, but really aren't. So if you're rehearsing a flashbulb memory and something fits the pattern of the event you're thinking about, your brain can make it part of the memory without you even realizing. Studies done on flashbulb memories after 9/11 helped confirm this. Researchers realized that the horrible tragedy probably generated flashbulb memories in a lot of people. So they started doing studies. For example, one group at Duke University quickly gathered 54 volunteers and asked them to describe their experiences on that day. The participants were also asked to describe another, more ordinary event that had happened a couple days before. Then, the researchers brought the participants back either 1, 6, or 32 weeks later and asked them to recall both memories. Their descriptions of the ordinary events got less accurate over time, which wasn't surprising. When asked, the volunteers all said that the much more vivid 9/11 memory would be more consistent. But here's the thing. The subjects' memories of what they did on 9/11 were just as inconsistent as the ordinary memories from the same time. People felt like they remembered vivid details from 9/11, but those details were different from what they told to the researchers right after it happened. In fact, 42% of the inconsistencies in both kinds of memories came from the distinctive details the subjects thought were true. In another, larger study, 2,000 people were surveyed about their memories of finding out about the terrorist attacks on 9/11. They responded to surveys 1 week, 1 year, 3 years, and 10 years after the attacks, and their memories of the details became less consistent over time. On average, by the time people took the survey 3 years after the attacks, they only remembered 57% of the details accurately, even though they were sure they were remembering right. 10 years after the attacks, the accuracy was about the same, so people's memories got less accurate at first, but then stabilized. So what does this mean for your flashbulb memories? Well, not everything in a flashbulb memory is completely wrong. The basics of what happened are probably accurate, but the vivid details that make it feel so fresh, those are a lot less trustworthy. Even if they feel like they happened yesterday, your flashbulb memories aren't perfect. Thank you for watching this episode of SciShow Psych.
So here's the last piece of the puzzle. And when we're talking about the tie between emotion and memory, we know that intense emotion form intense memories because they trigger a rise in stress hormones, and these hormones trigger activity in the amygdala, which is located next to the memory-forming hippocampus. So if that amygdala is going off, the the hippocampus is going to be more readily able to do its job, and it's going to be kind of on high alert, if that makes sense. So anyway, we know the amygdala increases memory-forming activity and engages the frontal lobes of the basal ganglia to tag the memories as important. So we know that there is a connection between emotion and memory. If something is a very emotionally traumatic or exciting experience, we're more likely to remember it, right? And that's part of those flashbulb memories that we just kind of looked at. Is generally speaking, there are emotions tied to them, but those emotions can get murky and they can kind of mix up what our memories really are. So then the last here, this is another way to look at that chart that I had put together of the encode, store, retrieve. Here you have memory processing, you have automatic and effortful, implicit, processed by the basal ganglion. This is things like space-time frequency, classical conditioning, motor cognitive skills. On the other side, effortful, this is like studying. This is explicit memories processed in the hippocampus, general knowledge and facts and personally experienced events. Okay, so that's what I have for you in regards to our intro to memory. Tomorrow, like I said, we're going to talk about retrieval and forgetting. So yeah.
All right, team, there you have it. That's all you got to do today. Watch this lecture, take notes on it. Tomorrow there will be a quick formative check on all of these kind of aspects of memory. So just be looking for that after tomorrow's lecture is posted.